Thank you. Thanks. So thanks very much to the organisers. Thanks for letting me speak. Really interesting discussions already, and I'm sure there'll be lots more of them. So what I want to do is take things slightly theoretical in a way that's hopefully maybe illuminating, maybe partly annoying. So I'm going to be talking from the level of normative political theory or political philosophy about some of the issues around political legitimacy with respect to transitional justice contexts. So what I want to do is to try and sketch the outline of an account of political legitimacy which is philosophically cogent, which makes sense, but which is also sensitive to some of the problems endemic to transitional societies, and which also differs from the mainstream view insofar as it does not presuppose the democracy. It does not say that, you know, democracy is... Sorry. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, yeah, I didn't think about it. Yeah. I can try and change the... oh. Okay. Okay. Maybe? Just white, okay. Plain white. Oh, no. Oh, it's much shorter this way.
No, I think that is the light would be...
Is that... I guess I'll talk through it and hopefully... Yeah, sorry. Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah, so an account which is... which differs from the mainstream democratic view. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So, first of all, the problem of political legitimacy. Well, so this is a sort of old problem in political philosophy, but I think it also has a bearing on cases of transitional justice. So, I mean, one of the things that transitional justice is concerned with is this process of transition from conflict or illegitimate rule, authoritarian rule, to states which are legitimate, by which we normally mean democratic. They respect the rule of law. So this is the sort of mainstream view, I suppose. And naturally, I think this begs the question of what is legitimacy? What do we mean by a state that's legitimate? I should say that I'm not going to be concerned with the legitimacy of trials, as the book is about, although my account may have perhaps some implications for that. It's a really interesting question, but I'm more interested in political legitimacy, which I'll define shortly. So many commentators take this democratic view, and I think obviously for good reasons. Democracy is valuable, and what I want to do is actually introduce two challenges on a sort of theoretical level for this democratic account. But we see this view a lot in the scholarship around transitional justice, and also in policy documents such as the International Centre for Transitional Justice, which writes that transitional justice should be designed in such a way to strengthen democracy. And I think the sort of assumption here, or it's not always an assumption, it's defended, the idea is that the legitimacy of states and of governments is determined by democratic procedures, democracies, and it follows, therefore, that democracy should be a sort of central goal of transitional justice, insofar as, you know, basically what legitimacy means, according to this account, is democracy, and what illegitimacy means is undemocratic or authoritarian states. That's the two concepts are synonymous, and I guess one of the things I want to do is maybe challenge that a little bit. So what do we mean by political legitimacy? Well, I think we talked a little bit about the Weberian account. My account is, or the one that political philosophers and moral theorists talk about, is the moral account or the normative account of legitimacy, which is often distinguished from the descriptive Weberian view. So the moral account is basically the idea that of the question of political legitimacy according to the moral or normative account is the question of the conditions under which a state is morally justified in coercing citizens, chiefly through the imposition and enforcement of law, backed up with a threat of sanctions and punishments. So all jurisdictions in the world use law, they coerce citizens through law. The question, according to the normative account of legitimacy, is why is this justified? Why is this morally okay? So there's two reasons, well, there are at least two reasons why this sort of moral account is important, I think. First is the basic thought that laws restrict liberty, and insofar as laws direct and restrict the otherwise free conduct of citizens, they require moral justification. We need a moral argument about why that's okay. And secondly, states not only restrict liberty, but they also claim a monopoly on authority. So they coerce citizens in such a way as to exclude other potential agents from coercing. They say, we are the only ones with the authority to coerce. And insofar as states do that, we again require a moral argument, require a moral justification. So this question of political legitimacy is importantly distinct, I think, although there's some disagreement about this, it's importantly distinct from the question of political obligation, which pertains to the conditions under which individuals are individually morally obliged to obey the law. So I'm going to maintain that distinction, and it's going to be important later on for some of the stuff I want to say with respect to democracy. But chiefly what I'm interested in here is this moral justification for coercion. That's what I mean by legitimacy. So democratic legitimacy, it's a very popular view, and for good reason. There's a lot in support of it. And there's a number of ways in which this sort of view can be cashed out, and indeed lots of different theories give this view. But the basic idea, or the broad assumption, is that a state is legitimate, by which we mean morally justified, in coercing, by virtue of procedures which afford all citizens the opportunity to determine who governs and the nature of the laws that are introduced, and then we then grant the right to govern to the majority-supported government. So that's the sort of premise of the democratic account. But what I want to do here is introduce two questions or problems or challenges to this view. And importantly, these are challenges which I want to claim are exacerbated by certain features of transitional justice context. You know, as much as it makes sense to generalize, obviously each transitional justice context has its own features, but I'm going to speak at a certain level of generalization, and I want to say that certain features of these contexts exacerbate these problems with democracy. And then I'm going to present my alternative view tentatively, and hopefully maybe I'll convince some of you, maybe not. So it's a very traditional, my challenge to democracy is a very traditional one, and it's a sort of old school theoretical complaint about democratic legitimacy, and it says that it takes the form of the tyranny of the majority. So this is what some Enlightenment thinkers pointed to as a problem with democracy, and their worry was, and the worry is, that democracy, or at least a majoritarian system, can sometimes, or is open to the worry that it can grant power to a majority-supported government which can license injustice against minority groups. So that's the basic theoretical complaint against democracy. Now, someone could turn around and say, well, okay, that's fine, but let's look at democracies. Well, we talked about the problem of democracies earlier. They do kill people sometimes. But someone might say that, well, this is just a theoretical complaint. It's just an issue with democratic theory. It's not an issue with democracy in practice. But actually what I want to say is, if we look at context of democratization and transitional justice cases, there are two descriptive features of these cases which can exacerbate this problem of the tyranny of the majority, such that we should be skeptical about the idea that democracy can justify political coercion. So the first problem is that transitional contexts are often contexts in which there are rival ethnic, religious, national groups. We can think of a number of cases, but the Balkans, thinking close to home, South Africa and Iraq, these are contexts in which there are rival ethnic groups, such that if we implemented democratic legitimacy, if we tried to impose a democratic system too early, then there is the real worry that the majority could persecute a minority. That's a worry that's exacerbated by a feature of these transitional contexts. And the second problem is an issue with institutional development. So I think that what we commonly find in transitional justice contexts is poorly developed legal mechanisms and political mechanisms whose raison d'etre, whose reasons for existence is precisely to protect minority rights. So we can think of things like an independent judiciary. Often if we think of cases like Argentina, we don't have independent judiciaries. We have judiciaries which pander to authoritarian governments, and these remnants are still often there in the wake of these governments being deposed or whatever. So that's one thing, an independent judiciary. Also procedures such as judicial review, which play a really important role in limiting the legislative decisions of a majority. Other things include sort of law and order things, so things like a developed police force, legal systems which can effectively implement human rights law, institutions which protect free speech and the freedom of the press, and therefore afford an outlet for expression to minority groups. So these institutional devices, which in developed democracies, at least in principle, should protect minority rights or help minority rights, are commonly not present in the case of less developed states or transitional justice states. And the thought is that, or my claim is that these two things can exacerbate the problem of the tyranny of the majority, such that we should be skeptical about the idea that democracy can justify coercion. So that's my worry with democracy. Here's my alternative view, and this is sort of, I suggest this tentatively, but the alternative account I want to put forward is a sort of human rights-based view. And the basic idea is that a state is morally justified in using coercion through law if in doing so it serves to protect the basic human rights of all individuals, including minority groups, importantly. So speaking on a sort of level of moral philosophy or normative theory, we can suggest three moral principles that support this sort of view. The first is that, thinking in an everyday case of self-defense, we generally assume or take it almost for granted that some level of coercion or even violence is justified to protect the rights of innocent individuals. And insofar as that principle holds in self-defense cases, it supports the view that a system of law itself, which is coercive to some extent, can be justified if it serves to protect human rights. The second view is that the second principle is that it's sometimes permissible to introduce a system of law. So I guess we can see this in the sort of ubiquity of human rights law around the globe at the moment. So I think one of the moral arguments there is it just looks permissible to introduce systems of law which protect human rights. It just looks morally okay, a good thing, assuming other conditions are met, such as that the system is not overly draconian or, the third point, I suppose one of the virtues of a human rights-based account is that it not only explains why coercion is sometimes justified, but it also sets important limits to that coercion, for instance, prohibiting types of coercion that violate human rights. So things like torture or cruel and inhumane punishments. A human rights-based view of legitimacy would inform a prohibition against these sorts of measures. That's the thought, anyway. So what we have here in this alternative view, the alternative to the democratic view, is the basis for, I think, the basis for a moral justification of a very basic form of human rights law. So it's basic in the sense that it might not include the full list of political and social rights or economic rights and these sorts of things. We have this sort of core rights of, freedom from torture, life, liberty, the big stuff. So I want to introduce three, and annoyingly perhaps these are sort of hypothetical cases. I don't really have cases from the real world. Philosophers are annoying like that. So here's three hypothetical cases which I hope support your intuitions about this human rights view. So imagine these sorts of cases. So imagine a case in which a rich elite is overthrown by an illegitimate, other way around. Imagine that a rich elite overthrow an illegitimate government which is responsible for serious human rights violations. The elite take charge of the legislative institutions of the state, and they implement new laws which serve or succeed in protecting basic human rights. So that's the first case. Second case is a sort of transitional government case. So imagine that a transitional government is put in place undemocratically. They're just implemented in the wake of a civil war. And this government succeeds through law in securing political stability and the protection of basic human rights. And the third case is the military intervention case. So suppose that an international military power intervenes in a state in the midst of conflict, succeeds in ceasing the conflict, and implements a government which succeeds in keeping the peace and protecting the basic human rights of citizens. So according to the human rights-based view, I want to suggest that in each of these cases, the respective state has a claim to legitimacy insofar as they protect rights, human rights, and importantly, even though they are not democratically elected. So that's and I suppose these cases are also meant to support the view that democracy is neither necessary or sufficient for political legitimacy, and that the protection of human rights is sufficient. Maybe that's slightly controversial, I'm not sure. So this account may look crazy or something because there's no place for democracy, and it's almost just a given that what we mean by transitional justice is a movement to democracy. That's what we mean generally, and this is ubiquitous in the literature and stuff. What I want to suggest is that there might be a role for democracy within this view. It's just not with respect to the question of the justification of coercion. So it's not with respect to the question of legitimacy. So earlier I introduced a distinction between political legitimacy, which means the moral justification of coercion, and the question of political obligation, which is the question of what morally obliges citizens to obey the law. So it could be that insofar as we want these two things in a justification of the state, it could be that democracy, and this is quite tentative, it could be that democracy plays a role in generating political obligations. So it does things like it generates the content of laws and explains who comes to rule the state even. It doesn't justify their use of coercion, because I want to say that human rights protection does that. But it does do other things like generate a political obligation to obey the law, establish the content of the laws, and even explain who rules. It just doesn't do the thing about justifying the actual use of implementation of law. So that's quite tentative. But the idea is that democracy is not completely pushed out of the picture on this account of political legitimacy. It just doesn't do the justification of coercion. So how am I doing for time? 3 minutes, excellent, right, good. Here's a sort of, again, slightly sensitive, but it's one way in which we could apply this sort of theory to a transitional justice case. So imagine that we conceive of the process of transition in a tripartite way. So that we've got three different phases. The first phase is the illegitimate state. The second phase, the transitional phase, is this legitimate government, and on my account, legitimacy is a state which protects human rights. They are morally justified in this second phase. And then the third phase, which I've called the end goal state, although it's slightly awkward on, sorry, that's not a very... the end goal state, the thing that we want to get to, is something that is both politically legitimate and also morally justified in imposing obligations on citizens to obey the law. And this requires both human rights and some form of democratic participation. That's the thought. So we can distinguish these two questions of legitimacy and political obligation. Legitimate states protect human rights. Legitimate states and states which can impose political obligations both protect human rights and are democratic. That's the thought, or that's a case of application, how it could be interesting in a sort of theoretical application. Here's my sort of conclusion, a few tentative suggestions. The basic thrust, or the basic idea behind my account, is that effective democracy requires the protection of human rights. It's almost a necessary condition, I think. A necessary condition for democracy to work is that we establish the basic conditions for political cooperation. We need people's rights to be protected if they're going to even be able to go to the voting booth to vote democratically. And to prevent things like the tyranny of the majority. So the idea behind my account is that establishing these preconditions, the protection of rights, justifies the use of law by the state. And then we can then go on to talk about democracy, but what we want is the protection of human rights first. So that's the idea. There are lots of other further questions, such as how this may pertain to a justification of things like trials in the transitional period. Maybe it suggests a sort of deterrence role for trials. If trials do something in protecting human rights by deterring potential rights violators, then according to this count, that might be the sort of way we go with it. Political amnesties even, we may have a case for the alternative to political trials, an amnesty. If the prospect of a trial is going to exacerbate human rights violations, well, then maybe there's a case for amnesty, according to this view. And things like institutional restructuring. But anyway, I'm going to leave it there, but thank you very much for listening.